Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to be able to be here today. And this government says that they're doing well on the environment. That's clearly not true. It's not the case. And I'll give an example just quickly from my own riding. There's a group of people trying to work with Environment Canada on setting up a new pasture lease situation. And what they find is that Environment Canada is dictating to them at every point. They're telling them about the employment that they need there. They're setting the provisions of the agreements, refusal to be able to work with the community. They're threatening them if they've told them if they don't do it our way, we're going to make this much more difficult for you. You'll be jumping through hoops for a long period of time. They're condescending to them, where they're assuming that any local activity is destructive. They don't want to talk to the local people. They don't want to give them any control over anything to do with the project. And basically, they've shown a complete inability to be able to respond to unique situations because they don't recognize or understand the area. We're seeing that in this bill as well. And there is a better way, Mr. Speaker, which is that Environment Canada, Natural Resources, and Oceans and Fisheries needs to begin to work with local communities. Trust that actually people on the ground understand a little bit about what's going on in their area, and we've seen that in our part of the riding in particular with some of these situations. So I just want to ask the member opposite, and I also should point out this is actually going to be the only opportunity I have to debate this bill. So when they said everyone's had fair opportunity, that's not true. But how is this bill going to change the attitude of the ministers of Fisheries and Oceans, Environment and Natural Resources so that they can actually begin to work with local communities instead of destroying them?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I recognize and value and commend the contribution of the member. I would like to signal that his view on the importance of being mindful of local circumstances. This view is not only right, but it's also exactly at the center of this bill. This bill, when you read it carefully, it recognizes the importance of a case-by-case analysis. Canada is a vast country. Canada has a vast number of Canadians interested in the protection of their environment, of the marine environment in particular, and that's why it's so important, as the member says, and as the bill explicitly states, to take into account the local circumstances, the local knowledge, and science and consultation adapted to the context of the projects being analyzed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This comes back to something that I raised a little bit earlier, and that is not only the lack of consultation, but the lack of willingness to work with local communities. I've got a community pasture in my area that they're trying to make an agreement with Environment Canada so they can use it the way they've used it for 70 years, and they found in dealing with this that Environment Canada is only interested in really dictating to them. They're going to tell them how many employees they have and how they're going to use them. They've talked about threatening them. If you don't do it our way, we're going to make this a lot more difficult for you than it is right now. They basically assume that anything that local communities do are destructive, when these are the people who've lived there for 100 years who actually have been able to manage a very hostile environment and do well at it. So I'm just wondering if he thinks that this bill is actually going to improve this government's attitude towards local communities.
Honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
From Cypress Hills grasslands, and he comes from ranch country like I do, and a lot of to his question about do I think the government's actually going to change and listen to people instead of trying to shove them around. I think all you got to do is look at everything from the attestation for Canada Summer Jobs, and I could go on and on, Madam Speaker, but the simple answer is no, they're not going to change, and they think they know better. And while, since this member is from Saskatchewan, Madam Speaker, originally when the changes that came about in 2012, they came about because of residents across Saskatchewan, through Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, SARM, brought it to our attention, and I thought it was only in Ontario as a farmer at the time. We found out it's right across the country. So the answer again is no, they're not going to change.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I got up a little bit earlier and asked a previous speaker a question, but we did have a project in my area when our government was in power. It was to do with leasing pasture land, and Environment Canada was very cooperative with us. The deputy minister came out. Chief of Staff came out and sat down with the local community. There was a local community group that was set up in order to handle this. The government had left the impression that they would be directing research funding through that area, kind of a pilot project, and the local people would have a lot of say over how that money might be distributed, the research that might be done, and they gave credit to local people for having knowledge about how to manage that area. That's changed. Now we see a situation where the local people are threatened, where they're intimidated, where they're condescended to, and the attitude seems to be that Environment Canada knows most everything. And I don't know that that attitude came from the Environment Canada people themselves as much as it did from this government. So as this member's talking about this legislation, tell us a little bit about whether you think this is going to make it easier for local communities to work with the government and with Environment Canada, or make it much more difficult. We did have a good relationship in my part of the world. That seems to have gone out the window, and I wonder what he sees happening along the fisheries notions with this bill.
The honourable member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank the honourable member for that question from Grasslands. You know, without proper consultation, working with the Indigenous people of the area, with the local ranchers and dealing with agricultural leases for rangeland and stuff like that, it has to be done. We need to work with the local ranchers. We need to work with the local counties, with the local Indigenous groups, and plan ahead. What was said, and I'm going to refer back to my favorite report here because I sat on that committee, Madam Chair, is taking action today and establishing protected areas for Canada's future. You know, we'd have the environmental groups come in and tell us that they wanted to protect all this land. And then we'd have the environment, not the environment, but the natives from northern Canada, from the Northwest areas, the Inuit, come in and say, whoa, whoa, slow down. We want to be involved in the consultation. We want to talk about what's best for the land that we live on. We want to know how we're going to protect the economy for our future, but also protect the environment. And I think that's what it's about. And this is fast-tracking. And Bill C-55 is fast-tracking, putting these protected areas in immediately, and then do the consulting after or the negotiating after.